President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was running for his 5th term after 20 years in power. So the people took up to the street on February 22nd in a very peaceful and civic way, and they took up to the street for the 3rd week, and today for the 14th week. And actually, this took the regime off guard, meaning the Algerian regime was not expecting such scale of protest and so on and so forth. So since then, just not to go too long on the details, since then President Bouteflika stepped down. He left power. His brother Saïd Bouteflika, who is believed to have run the country since the sickness of his brother, has been jailed. The head of the security agency, former head Toufiq, has been jailed as well, and 5 or 7 business tycoons have been jailed on the charge of corruption. Yet the Algerian Hirak did not stop. Algerians took up to the street for the 14 weeks, and they are going to do it again this Friday. So we are reaching a situation in which it is a difficult situation in the sense that the Algerian military are no longer, or it seems they are showing some signs of assertiveness. They don't want to do or to make more concessions, and the Algerian people are not eager to ask for less. As you may know, there was this slogan, shi'ar, called Yitnahawga, which means you will all be removed, and the Algerian people are actually asking for the overhaul of the regime. So the question was first to understand why did the military abandon President Bouteflika. Many analysts this decision, but 4 weeks before this happened, I wrote a piece for a French journal, Libération, in which I said the military are going to abandon their candidate and to sacrifice him because simply they are going to make a calculus, of the risks and rewards, and they are going to take a rational decision, which is they knew that by the opposition to what they did in 2014, when Bouteflika was still sick, but he wanted to present himself for a 4th term. Back then, the military backed him up. Why? Because they knew that he can prevail. This time, it was different. His health situation was terrible. The street, when millions of Algerians took up to the street and put pressure on the regime, it was basically impossible for the military to back up Bouteflika because it was impossible for him to prevail. So they weighed the costs, if I may say, and took the best decision for them accordingly. What is now and what was the role of the military in Algeria? To understand the role of the Algerian military, which is, by the way, one of the strongest military in the region after the Egyptian, is very important to understand what kind of military we are talking about. So studies showed, actually, we tend in the research and in academia to look at the military as being either the ruler or the arbitrator, where I don't agree really with that. I think in the Algerian case, these stages of intervention or withdrawal from politics are not static. In the Algerian history, you have moments in history where the Algerian military were ruling and moments when they were arbitrating. Just to give you a concrete example, under President Houari Boumediene, the military were ruling, and it was obvious. But then President Boumediene died in 1978, and the military were in a difficult situation because there was a big conflict between then Abdelaziz Bouteflika and Mohamed Saleh Yahyaoui, who wanted both to be president. The military intervened as an arbitrator of the civilian authority, and they put an end to the conflict by imposing a consensual candidate, which was Shadli Ben Jadid back then. It was the military, a faction of the military, and also the head of the intelligence service, Qasdi Mirbah, who decided to put an end to this conflict and bring Shadli Ben Jadid. When Shadli Ben Jadid came, he decided to modernize the military, and the military went back to their barracks. So they were more in the arbitrator role, if I may say. But then the riots of October 5th, 1988 happened, and then the military intervened again directly. They shoot on people, 500 youth died, and then we had again this process where the military were ruling the country. When the riots ended and we had then the Islamic Salvation Front coming almost to power, the Salvation Front was on the brink of winning the legislative election in 1992. Then a military coup happened and the military intervened again directly to quote unquote save democracy and to save the republic. But they took a full hold of the country. Then we had the Black Decade, in which the military played a very important role in the fight against terrorism and so on and so forth. And then President Bouteflika came in power in 1999. So what pushed the military in 1999 to go back to their barracks and to decide to have this role as an arbitrator of the civilian facade? Well, as Yazid said it, the military needs to have assurances. Back then, President Bouteflika gave them the assurance of two things. The first one is their privileges. Their privileges, meaning the budget, the careerists, the private sector, the private companies were not touched. So they have these assurances. The second assurance, which was the most important one, was that there will be no trial or prosecution for the human rights violation and abuses that happened from members of the security forces during the Black Decade. So this is what pushed the military to go back to their barracks. They cut a deal basically with President Bouteflika and they come back to them. But since the Hirak, we have a military with at its head, as you may know, who is today the strong man, if I may say, of Algeria, who is Chief of Staff Gaid Saleh, who has been in this negotiation giving to protesters week after week. So week after week, the concessions were made. But today, it seems like the military are not eager anymore to give concessions because they deem that the demands of the Algerian people are, quote unquote, irrational and almost malicious. So we are reaching a situation in which the question is, what are the military going to do? What's the next move? So in order to answer this question, we need to, while it is difficult actually to predict the reaction of the People National Army in Algeria, but one thing is sure, in predicting this answer, we need to look at two very important things. The first thing is the safeguard of its institutional well-being. Before doing anything, the military in Algeria are going to make sure that their privileges and interests are going to be secured. The second thing is the safeguard of its cohesion. It's very important for a military institution, be it in Algeria or anywhere else, to keep its reputation and to keep its cohesion. In the Algerian case, this cohesion was was touched, if I may say, during the 90s, because the leadership and the young officer were not totally, did not totally agree about the management of the crisis. Today, we are almost in the same situation where, as Yazid say, we have a military that is homogeneous in Algeria, and we have a military in which conscription is universal. People come from all over the region in Algeria to go and to do their conscription. So we have a military that is homogeneous, and we have a military that also built relationship with its society during these 14 weeks. And actually by the way, it is very important to note that for 14 weeks, there was no violence whatsoever during these protests. So today the question is, even if the leadership will take the decision to take repressive actions, what are the young officer and the middle officer going to actually take the orders? How an officer and these officers are going to take the chance to shoot at a crowd in which their mother, their sister, and even their kids, because it's been very peaceful, and kids are taken to these protests. So the question is the military going to take such a decision? And is the military eager also and willing to take the burden of sullying its reputation nationally and internationally? Another option, but again, this depends on the calculus, is towards democratization. Studies actually showed that loyalty shift, I insist on loyalty shift because many analysts called what happened in Algeria in March 2019 a coup. It wasn't a coup, it was a loyalty shift. Loyalty shift have a good record of producing transitions to democracy within 3 years. So if this has to happen in Algeria, then for the military to allow for such an opening towards more democratization, again, they will have to have, assurances about their privileges, their interests, their economic interests, and also about not being held accountable in front of a civilian facade. And I will stop.
شكرا داليا. يعني
Thank you, Dalia, for these important points. Moving on to Sudan and then with Libya. So let's start with Sudan and with my colleague Rasha Mawad from Sudan.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for inviting me and send my kind regards to all of you gathered here today. For us here in Sudan, we are going through revolutionary moments right now in our country. We are very hopeful. We have a lot of expectations after getting rid of this regime that prevailed for a long time and that controlled our country for more than 30 years. The role of the army when it comes to Sudanese politics, starting with the Islamist movements and until the revolution this year, is something that I would like to tackle from the point of view of the democratic tendency that I have, and saying that one of the standards of democracy in a state is for the military to be under the control of civil political authorities that are freely elected by the people. However, this democratic standard that all democracies agree upon is absent in many Arab countries, or does not exist in many Arab and African countries as well, since there is a very big role given to military forces, and they consider that their role is not limited to military service or to the protection of a country, but they believe that they must govern, that they must have a certain authority over other parties. This concept has been a reason for a for a long-term suffering in Sudan. And the military is not the only party to blame in Sudan. Politicians had a role in this tendency as well. In our experience in Sudan, we can clearly see that the modern elite, political elite in Sudan, cannot make it to authority or to government through democratic elections, because our society in Sudan is a traditional society, and it focuses on religious traditional political parties. That is why the political elite aimed at reaching authority through the military. In fact, there are many political cells inside the Sudanese military. And what changed the whole landscape in Sudan was the Islamist coup supported by Islamists under Omar al-Bashir on the 30th of June in 1989. This coup was a tradition, or was not a traditional military coup as the ones we witnessed in the region, but rather a coup that was orchestrated by an Islamic movement, movement with very well-known affiliations nationally and internationally. This coup that was executed by Islamists at that time was a coup against a democratically elected government. Although we can say a lot of negative things about the government at that time, because there were a lot of political problems, however, still, it was the only government that was freely or elected, democratically elected in the Arab region at that time. What did these Islamists do with the Sudanese army? The army in previous coups um, was a tool that was used by political parties to execute this coup. However, the army itself was not used this time. Islamists used the army only to make it to government. However, their political plan implicitly aimed at destroying the army itself. The result of that was what we saw at the end of the day, and that is to use the army and transform it into a militia with a beliefs that are similar to Islamist beliefs, to the political Islam ideology. However, this plan succeeded only partially. Why? Because al-Bashir, who is an Islamist general that led the coup, had new selfish expectations and hopes, and he wanted to be the only one in power. So this hindered the Islamist transformation of the army, of course, and I say here it hindered this process. It did not stop it categorically, because today in the Sudanese army we see a lot of officers that are affiliated with this Islamist movement, this Islamist ideology. However, the Sudanese army is still considered to be an army, so it was not categorically transformed into an Islamist power, such as was the case with many other institutions in Sudan. Dr. Hassan Abdullah al-Turabi was the pioneer here in transforming the army, as we said. What was the reaction of Islamist political parties here? It was to create paramilitary forces, militias, such as the Popular Defense Militia. It is an Islamist militia. After the war broke out in Darfur in 2003, there was a heavy reliance on tribal militias as well. And these tribal militias, after the end of the war, if I may say, in Darfur, were transformed into government forces or organized forces, mainly the the militia of Muhammad Hamdan Duglu. This militia specifically was targeted by al-Bashir. He focused a lot on this militia because he wanted to rely on this militia whenever the people would revolt or rebel against him, because they have a lot of soldiers in their ranks. They have a lot of heavy weapons as well. They have good funding, good financial resources. And the problem that happened, and that clearly explained the situation in Sudan, is that this militia was used as a scarecrow for the army, the official army. Because whatever we may say about the internal strife inside the Sudanese army, when compared to this militia, it is of course more national, more patriotic, more ready to play the role of a national army, of course. The complication that happened is that this militia that was prepared to protect al-Bashir was supported by regional forces such as the UAE and Saudi, linked to the war in Yemen as well. So, of course, this militia was used in the war against Yemen, and al-Bashir wanted, of course, to gain the support of these GCC countries. However, now this militia became an independent body, an independent entity, and regional countries prefer dealing with these militias whenever they have a war to engage in. So when this happened, the support that al-Bashir had became or started to dissipate and disappear, and what was and the entity that protected the revolution now in Sudan was the army, and what and the entity that protected the Sudanese from al-Bashir was officers from the army. This the militia that I already mentioned as well protected the Sudanese people, did not attack the Sudanese people, because they understood that al-Bashir no longer has the regional support that he enjoyed in the past. Therefore, they knew that it was a losing cause for him. Now, the other problem is that those who took power from al-Bashir were not the officers that supported the revolution, but rather small officers and important officers who, ideologically speaking, are a continuity of the previous regime. Therefore, Sudan is facing a problem now, which is how to ensure transfer to civil forces, transfer of power, of course, to civil sources. However, this revolution was not led by revolutionary forces. Now, revolutionaries are in the street. They only have very fair and just demands, of course, and that is to topple this dictatorship. However, sorry for the interruption. We still have to talk about Libya and the situation in Libya, the Libyan case. Allow me to end. Yes, you may end your intervention. So I will end by saying that now you have revolutionaries in the street, and you have the military authority that is trying to impose a de facto authority, and trying to show that they are in charge of the situation. They are responsible for the Sudanese people, but they have clear political interests, especially in supporting the militia that I already mentioned, the swift intervention militia, or the Janjaweed. So this is the situation in Sudan. Of course, there are differences between the well-known officers in the army and other officers or members of the army who view the revolution very differently. This may be the same in Libya as well, because we have practically the same players in Sudan and in Libya.
لموضوع ليبيا وطبعا العمليات
شكرا.
شكرا.
I'll give a few preliminary remarks in English, then I can switch to Arabic depending on the audience questions. Starting from where my colleagues ended, I think there is a difference between those cases and the Libyan case. Libya was never an example of a Praetorian state. The army did not rule Libya. This is a stereotype that is mistaken. This is completely different from other places in the Arab region. But before I go into this in more details, the fact that we try to separate always politics from military issues, security issues, is impossible. They are interlinked. It's normal that the military has influence in political life, economic and social life. They are part of a state, they are part of a polity. What is not normal, and this is the subject probably of our discussion today, is when the military takes over the civilian institutions and dictate its own policy. That's the problem. And most modern states in developed countries have managed to adjust this type of relationship, whereby you have strong institutions, strong state, and power is within the civilian realm with healthy negotiated relations with the military. In the case, this reminds me a little bit of the allegory that Plato used in the Republic, where he talked about the guardians of a city. And he used the allegory of the sheep, the wolf, and the dog. So basically, the military is the guardian of a city, but there's always a danger when the city in its political life is so weak that the guardians take over the polity in general. In the case of Libya, what I was saying before, that is not like other cases in the region. First of all, this comes back at the origin of the formation of the Libyan state. The Libyan state was not formed in an indigenous way. It was formed from outside. Libya was created by a decision from superpowers implemented by the United Nations. And the three provinces were put together into one unified country. The Sanusi monarchy never really was interested in building strong institutions or state, let alone a military. They was always weary of the role of military, the danger that they could have on this nascent state. When 1969, the coup that was staged by Gaddafi and his colleagues was also mistaken as the military coup, because those who did the coup were not, of course they were from the military, but they themselves stated later on that they joined the military, they decided to join the military to infiltrate the institutions so they can take over the power. And what I'm trying to say is that 1969 coup did not bring the military to power in Libya. It brought people from within the military based and put a sort of a system based mostly on tribal kinship than a strong military institution controlling the country. And like the Sanusi, but of course more developed in what Gaddafi used to call his third theory, universal theory, whereby the state was perceived as danger to society, and as such, the military was also perceived as a danger to society, and in particular, danger to the regime that was established by Gaddafi. Gaddafi came from within the ranks of the military, but never trusted it. So what he did, he continued to dismantle whatever existed from that military, never wanted to build an institutional military. What he did instead, he built many armed groups or mini militaries, his own private brigades, like the famous Khamis brigades. And these are the ones actually that were the Praetorian regime guards that defended Gaddafi's regime and intervened against the population in 2011 uprising. And because of this vacuum, this stateless system that was established from the origin in Libya and strongly buttressed by Gaddafi, when the 2011 uprising took place, immediately the security forces splintered. Those who stayed with the regime were those who were directly connected to it through system of rent and privileges, and mostly through tribal kinship. And those who were against it were the remnants of the old military, mostly in the east, with other people that took arms and joined what later on will be called as the LNA under Haftar today. After 2011 and the transition, the problem that Libya had to face is that there was, again, never a structured state, never strong civilian institutions that could carry out that transition, which was completely different from the case in Tunisia, where the army protected the country but never intervened in the revolution or in politics. So when today people talk about the Libyan army as trying to get back its role or retrieve whatever privilege it had before, I think it's mistaken, because what's happening in a way to the Libyan army is that it's being sidelined twice. It was sidelined during the monarchy, completely destructed during the Gaddafi regime, and after that, in 2011, those who came afterwards, and especially certain political forces that never managed to win the elections, were very weary of a strong military, and they decided to rebuild from the existing militia something new. And this vacuum is exacerbating today more and more the security situation in Libya. So instead of having institutions with the clear-cut hierarchy, you had what I would call heterarchy, which is basically different strata. They keep changing allegiances, they keep shifting allegiances depending on the rank they could receive or privileges they could receive. In 2015, the international community brokered a power-sharing agreement in Skhirat, Morocco, whereby they established the GNA, the one that is basically the government that is internationally recognized. But at the same time, you had the elected parliament that claims legitimacy, and rightly so, because it was the only institution that was elected and moved to Tobruk. But you had now two types of legitimacies fighting each other, one that is internationally recognized, one that it was elected. And the bone of contention regarding the military relationship to civilians was Article 8 in the agreement. The Article 8 states that the military command is under the control of the Presidential Council. And that is something that the parliament with Aqila Saleh, the head of the speaker of the parliament, never accepted, let alone Haftar. So in theory, Field Marshal Haftar has to report to the speaker of the parliament, which is Aqila Saleh. But even between these two, there are a lot of suspicion, because Field Marshal Haftar, with his presence on the ground, has much more power, much more presence on the ground than Aqila Saleh with his elected parliament. On the other side, you have what is internationally recognized, the Government of National Accord, that does not have enough teeth to monopolize legitimate violence in a way. This Weberian concept of collective violence that is only in the hand of the legitimate government does not exist in Libya. So the GNA is under the influence of militias that are basically the result of this vacuum of institutional weakness of Libya that was basically wide open after 2011. So today, the problem is not whether Field Marshal Haftar wants to reestablish a military rule that never existed, as I said before. It's actually, the problem is you do not have a state whereby that state could establish or negotiate relationship between civilian rule and the military. Until you and among that vacuum, you have many militias and armed groups that create more chaos and havoc and give legitimacy to the LNA intervening to establish security. So until we move from this concept of power sharing, which is unfortunately what the international community moved to since 2011, where you have agreements to share power, but never to establish a state, never to put in place institutions, then you can organize mechanisms to share power between the different actors in society. What was done was actually the opposite. So before we talk about this type of civil-military relationship in Libya, we have to get rid of that vacuum, which is the lack of institutions and the absence of state. Until we have this confusion between power and state in Libya, we will never be able to establish security and put in place a polity with institutions and mechanisms that control this type of relationship.
شكرا يونس. يعني هون يستحضر بالنقاش عمليا.
Thank you very much for this input. We can see clearly the commonalities between the different cases that we talked about. I would like to ask Yazid about the differences within the army. For example, in Sudan, whereby we talk about middle rank officers that decided to protect the people. Maybe in Algeria the situation is similar as well. Regarding the regional situation in supporting Khalifa Haftar in Libya, there's also the Turkish-Qatari party or alliance here on the other hand. So how can we clarify the picture here and come up with conclusions? I think this question should have been asked to Yunus regarding the Libyan situation specifically. But if we look at Yemen, Syria, Iraq, we see that the circumstances that allowed the military to become part of the equation is the fighting taking place. There is a war in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen as well. So this is the situation that allowed for regional powers to interfere in these countries and to have a military force that they support in these countries. And this, of course, makes a peaceful solution very difficult. So we can see the building of or how difficult it is to build one army, one military party or one military force in any country. So we have this we have the fact that people who hold weapons are always the strongest. With the absence of a dialogue, it is only weapons that can rule. So political parties that don't have a militia do not have any political power on the ground. This is what we clearly see in Syria, in Iraq, etc. Libya today is an advanced case of this principle, because we can see that militias have a prominent role in Libya. In Yemen, this is not the case because there is a history of politics in Yemen, sorry. So this is a very important element. But regarding the four countries that we are talking about, Egypt and Algeria did not witness this experience, while Sudan witnessed this experience, of course, with its wars on the borders with Chad, with the separation of South Sudan, and there were also foreign interferences under different forms. But in Sudan, the internal political strife over the over power, over ideology in this country was the main element that defined the internal politics of Sudan.
In the two cases, for instance, regarding Libya, there was a use of the army. There is something similar to what happened in Sudan. So the army was kind of manipulated into take part in the political movement that took place, be it the coup d'etat. So there was a pre-planned agenda to use the army for a certain purpose. Do you see any similarities between the case of Sudan No, I do not believe there are similarities between Sudan and Libya, and that there is an agenda to lead towards the interference of or the intervention of the army in the political life in Libya. As I said, during the monarchy, there was a marginalization of the army. Even during the rule of Gaddafi, the marginalization was huge. So there were other people who intervened against the Libyan people in 2011's revolution, and not the army itself. So this obsolete military faction of the army that we saw in Egypt with the Haftari's attempts, this could lead currently to a restoration of the honor of the army, which was marginalized during the monarchy and the Gaddafi rule. I cannot say clearly now what will be the role of the military in the future of Libya. Without the presence of a strong state with strong institutions, we cannot expect what happens in Libya. So we need to build the state in Libya and its institution before talking about the role of the military. And those who accept Haftar and those who are coming from the east, it's because they are they are accepted because he is trying to restore security in Libya, something that is currently missing with the weapons widely spread and the presence of different factions, armed factions in Libya coming through the open borders. So, however, we know that those armed parties in Sudan, in Libya, are putting a damper on building a strong state with institutions. Yes, but can we talk about the predominance of a certain figure, for instance, over the army, for instance, in Libya? And this is not something we could see in other countries, for instance, where the army is strong and where some high-ranked leaders and officers could agree on the structure, which is something we have seen with Bashir and Sisi. So can this hold true in Egypt, for instance, and Sudan? What we talked could be seen in all those four countries to different extents. Since, for instance, in some countries there are some weak institutions, government institutions, and that when the state is unstable, then we cannot know what the role would be. For instance, in Egypt, Egypt is a stable state, and the role of the military institutions was clear in building the state. So I will take your question as an introduction to what I wanted to say about Egypt and what we can read now in Sudan and Algeria, which provide two different models for a peaceful political transition that leads to a civic military relation that is more balanced and which leaves or which clearly defines the role of the civilians and of the military. In Egypt, this scenario is not on the table. And among the questions that we could ask is whether there is any desire, no matter how hidden it is, for the military in Algeria and Sudan and we've seen the meeting with the Sisi yesterday in Egypt, that the model of Egypt will be taken into consideration. So instead of having the transition as it is happening currently in Algeria, where civilians will be setting the agenda, will be doing, or putting the plans to build the state, and in Sudan, what is being seen is that the armed forces in Sudan eventually might take the decision to follow the Egyptian model, that is. In Egypt, the situation is totally different since there is no political transition, which I will not be defining as a democratic one, but or a peaceful, but it is a peaceful one. I believe that in the short future, political transition in a peaceful manner in Egypt will only be guaranteed by a military intervention. It will not come from a different source. So if there is such a transition, a peaceful transition to be offered, it will come from the military in Egypt, because the interests of the military, be it the different benefits, the budget, and so forth, those interests will be better served when the army will retrieve or will withdraw from the economic and political life. And this is a decision where the military will know that withdrawing from the economic and political level would better serve its interests, financial interest and other type of interests. The armed forces in Egypt, which are well loved and respected by the majority of Egyptians, are part of the civil government, which will be held accountable for any failure in the economic life or political institutions in Egypt. Allow me to shed light on two experiences in Brazil in 1974 and 9 years later in Chile, where the armed forces were the direct political ruler for more than for 10 and 13 years respectively. And at a point, a time came where the armed forces decided to negotiate with civilians to surrender the management or the governance. At some point, the reputation and internal unity of the military were endangered if the armed forces would be linked to the main failure of the 1964-1974 political rule, where there were crackdown on people, human rights abuses, and oppression. So the army in those countries wanted to salvage their reputation, and therefore they relinquished power to civilians. In in the Middle East, if the military forces decide to take a step back from taking part in the political life and also being awarded the main construction contracts in Egypt, for instance, since the architectural section within the army in Egypt is awarded the largest construction projects in Egypt. So the army is playing a centralized role, which also pinpointing a huge problem and weaknesses in the public institutions. So if Egypt or the army in Egypt decides to protect its reputation, then they will follow the Brazilian and the Chile experience. I believe that the military will see or will come to a point where it will realize that they should help technocrats manage the internal affairs. This requires negotiations with civilians, with political parties, or businessmen and elite classes. And here allow me to say that since 2013 in Egypt there is a paralysis of political parties in Egypt. This does not only apply to the Muslim Brotherhood. No, all other political parties which were aligned to Sisi are now marginalized and are no longer playing any media or political role. So those parties were kind of marginalized by the political power. They no longer play any role in politics and in designing policies. Unlike Brazil and Chile, the main danger in Egypt, as I see it, is that even if the military decides to negotiate to waiver its political role, there are no political parties to negotiate with. According to government statistics, 50% of people in Egypt live on the poverty line or below poverty line, in addition to high illiteracy rates and to lack of productivity. So all the economic indicators are declining. So in a few years, there will be an investment and capital problem in Egypt, also a problem in growth, in economic growth. So, and this is so far being concealed. Allow me also to say that there is a current indicator that is ushering a certain climate being prepared to waiver the role of the military to political parties. The military was involved in the work or in governance when there is any danger. So the legally speaking, the higher council of the military can, according to its own discretion, decide when the constitution is endangered and when the army should intervene. This strengthened the army, but this also could lead to having the Egyptian army play the same role as the Turkish army in 1988, where it intervened directly in the political life. So we're not talking about a total withdrawal of the political army and the army losing its possibility to intervene. So there should be some changes in Egypt, but will that mean that there will be a total change or a shift in the role of certain military officers within the army in Egypt and the government? I believe that in Egypt there should be a search for political parties and entities to negotiate with in the public arena, in the media life, in services, in the economic life, and there is an attempt by the military in Egypt to return some of the responsibilities in policy setting and in governance right now. Under the current circumstances, and if those attempts are taken 5 years from now, then the crisis in Egypt would have worsened, and it would be impossible for the army to find any parties to negotiate with. In Egypt, after the 2013 and the Fattah Sisi rule, what we saw is the clear withdrawal of the civil entities or institutions with the government. There is a problem among the government entities that are accused of being very corrupt and unable to govern. And in this case, what are the parallel steps that are being taken in order to rehabilitate the civic institutions of the Egyptian state? And this is something to be taken into consideration. We are now seeing some initial steps by the military in Egypt, but also by the presidency in Egypt to make some changes. Regarding the overlapping in between regional interventions in transitional periods, and here I would like to go to the case of Sudan and the support, the regional support to the transitional military council on one end, and the increased or the fact that the military council is not or will not accept a civil transition, an absolute civil transition in Egypt without, in Sudan, excuse me, without maintaining a certain role of the military. And I believe this is not the case in Algeria. I would like to hear from Russia on the regional support in the internal affairs of Sudan. You have the floor, Ms. Rasha.
شكرا لطرح هذا السؤال الكبير
I
جدا
would like to thank you
فعلا
for asking this important question, because what's
الوضع
happening in Sudan
هو التدخلات
now
الإقليمية
is
لصالح
or what we see in Sudan now is it's regional intervention in favor of the military
هو أن
council.
يظل السودان مشارك بقوات
Sudan,
في حق
or what
الوضع
is wanted,
وأن لا
is
يظل
to
الإمداد
have
العسكري السوداني
the
عن حافة
Sudanese
العرب
military
العناصر اللي
continue
ممكن
its
أن
role.
تحصل
UAE and Saudi Arabia would like
هذا الهدف
to
المحدود
have
وهو
the military
تأمين إمداد البلاد
play a role to achieve this objective, and this is why they are offering their support.
لها نشاط استنقاذي
And
لتحقيق
this
الهدف
is also why we can see that
منطقة غنية بالذهب
in Darfur
بالمناسبة
there are gold mining processes that are being taken place, and the returns are not going to the government of Sudan, and there are
كذلك
some deals that are being made without our state benefiting from gold, and there are interests for the Arab Gulf in those deals. This is why the Sudanese are calling for for better governance. The regional forces that are being or that are supporting the military council also aim at maintaining the role of the military over civilians, and civilians are being disregarded at some point. And now we hear talks about early elections, for instance, in Sudan. We all know that holding elections under current circumstances where the military have the final say will have the final say be to the military themselves. Dalia.
Talking about its foreign policy. It's a country that has always been very, jealous about its integrity and the territorial integrity, and it based its foreign policy on the sacred policy of non-intervention. When the NATO, for instance, decided to intervene in Libya in 2011, right? The Algerians were the first one to say we are against this intervention. We don't want any foreign forces in Libya. And actually the Algerians were right, because they said that foreign intervention is going to lead to the fragilization of the political situation, to immigration, illegal migration. And we all remember what happened after the fall of Muammar al-Gaddafi with the migration of Tuareg fighters to Mali, and few months after the fall of al-Gaddafi, we had Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb taken entire part of the northern country, which had a consequence again on Algeria, because 2013 the attack of the complex of gas facility of Ain Tiganturin happened. So it is a country basically that is very jealous of its integrity, that always respected the integrity, territorial integrity of its neighbors, and that has pretty good relationship with everyone, including Iran. I know in the region you have an obsession with Iran. It's not the case in Algeria. We have very good relations with pretty everyone. But lately, when Gaid Saleh decided in the heat of the Hirak to visit Russia and then left for Russia, I remember I was in Algiers back then, and I was in the protest. Signs appeared saying in French, "Le linge sale ne se lave ni à Moscou ni à Paris," meaning the dirty laundry is not washed neither in Moscow nor in Paris. The same happened when President Macron decided to make a statement, and the Algerians said, that we don't want any foreign intervention, especially not coming from France. In this Friday protest, slogans were very enlightening. People were chanting, "Gaid Saleh ya Shiyat al-Imarat," which means, "You, Gaid Saleh, sycophant of the Emirates," because Algerians have this perception that the Emirates are actually getting involved in Algerian politics. Well, whether this is true or not, one thing is sure: any kind of intervention in the conflict is going to aggravate the situation. Any kind of intervention, and actually the Moroccan neighbor has been very, very cautious about that. Moroccan didn't make any statement since the beginning of the Hirak in February 22nd, because the relations are very difficult. So at this stage, I think any kind of intervention might escalate the Algerians in their demands, meaning until now the demands have been pretty rational and the Hirak has been peaceful, but I think this kind of intervention might turn and alienate a big majority of the protesters against the military.
شكرا. بس في سؤال من يزيد لرشا وننتقل.
اوكي بشكرك على التدخل لصالحي.
Mr. Yazid, what do you have to comment here? What Russia said, even if the decision was to have the military council be the dominant party with the support of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, I believe that this will be only temporarily. And the fact that there are some differences among young officers and senior officers due to ideological discrepancies, and to what extent we can consider that the army is stable and unified. I believe that what's different between Sudan and Egypt is that Egypt is more stable. So what is the perspective for Sudan in this case? This is a very important question, Mr. Yazid. The problem in Sudan is that countries that want to control the fate of Sudan now are ignorant of the internal complications in Sudan. The military council, in its current structure, cannot rule. And what is being planned is to have a civic government at the level of the military, so it becomes under the rule of or the management of the military, and to have the military council be in charge of the foreign policy, of the call to go to war, and so forth. And this will not serve Sudan. There are some divisions among the army in Sudan, among young officers and senior officers, because junior officers or young officers are more numerous, and they are in favor of the popular movement in Sudan. The military in Sudan is different than the Egyptian army. It is not looked at as a national army due to the war between North Sudan, South Sudan, and the war with Darfur. We have many ethnicities represented in the army, so we're not talking about a national army. It needs restructuring so that all Sudanese can feel that they are represented in that army. Also, the army in Sudan is not the only armed forces. We have, for instance, some parties or armed people, thousands of armed parties and militias in Darfur and in the south of the Blue Nile that are present and that are dormant armed forces who could sabotage the peaceful transition. In addition to the fact that the dominance of the military will lead to instability and to escalation that's starting as of today in Sudan, and there is a call for riot, and this also leads to taking into consideration any dangerous military schemes. What is being done in Sudan or any intervention from regional parties in Sudan are not aware of the internal affairs of Sudan, and they want to achieve their own interests rather than the Sudan interests.
Maybe Egypt will be directly affected if there is an armed conflict in Sudan. However, Egypt is betting on the Sudanese army here, and it is an unrealistic bet, in my opinion. It is inadequate with the revolutionary atmosphere now in Sudan. So in Egypt, we see that the complications in Sudan will not allow for a good effect in Egypt. What will protect Sudan today is the appearance of a or the emergence of a civil force in Sudan that is backed by the Sudanese people, so that they can enter into a dialogue with these regional forces to convince them that in Sudan there is no alternative for civil authority. Thank you, Rasha. Moving on to the questions of the audience. Please introduce yourselves first and then ask the question. My name is Elias Farhat. I am a retired brigadier general from the Lebanese army. I have a question, but before that, an intervention to say that political parties in the Arab world no longer exist. We do not have civil entities in the majority of Arab countries. Even liberal movements, leftist movements have all disappeared in the Arab world. We have in the Arab world military institutions and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists. In Iraq, there are religious parties such as the Dawah party and other parties. So there are only religious parties and military institutions left today. We have a choice, or in Egypt, for example, they had a choice between a civil institution and another, or the military institution. But there were no civil institutions. In Sudan also the same happened. So there is no solution. Who wants change? Is it the Muslim Brotherhood? Is it another movement? It's not clear who are the forces of change in these countries. Their destiny or their future is also unknown in the absence of civil entities or known people, known politicians. We don't see these figures. So you only have either religious parties or the military. There is no third option, unfortunately. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your interventions. My question is about the military and terrorism. Do you believe, or do you see a current tendency in Northern Africa specifically to impose military rule under the pretext of terrorism? Is there international consensus to help the military gain power in these countries of Northern Africa, because they believe that only the military is able to fight terrorism? Is it the destiny of Arab countries to live with the absence of democracy? Or do European countries believe that the military is beneficial for these countries? We will take one more question, and then the answers, and then another round of questions. My question is about the intervention of the military in light of economic crises. What are the results of economic austerity, in your opinion, on the Lebanese army? And what do you think about some information about competition between MP Gibran Bassil and the head of the Lebanese military for the presidency of the Republic? So I know that it is outside the context of the 4 countries that you are mentioning. I am talking about Lebanon. But my question also is about, or I have another question about Iran as well. What about the rise of Qasem Soleimani as a candidate, as a presidential candidate? I have an answer for Algeria and the forces, the military forces versus civil forces. I think that Russia can tell you that there is a lot of political diversity. There are many political figures, maybe more diverse than Egypt, in light of political parties that were active recently. So let's start with the terrorist versus the military.
Between today and the 90s is that in the 90s, when the People National Army in Algeria decided to shoot on protesters, the justification was they are radical Islamists. They are radical Islamists from Al-Jabha al-Islamiyya lil-Inqad. And this trick and this narrative actually worked because they put themselves in the position of the savior of the Republic. Today the situation is different. The majority of protesters are secular, exactly like the majority of the members of the army. So that if the army takes the decision to shoot on the crowd, what justification it can bring? Now when it comes to the Islamists in Algeria, and I just published a paper on the shifting powers of structure of political Islam in Algeria, we need to understand that the threat of political Islam in Algeria has to be mitigated today. We are no longer in the 90s when, for instance, an Islamist party like the FIS was capable of galvanizing millions of Algerians and convincing them to take up to the street and then to take weapons against the state. Today, the Islamist parties in Algeria are in decline. As a matter of fact, when Islamist leaders in Algeria, for instance, the main leader of the main Islamist party, the MSP, the Movement for Society and Peace, Abdelrazak Makri, took up to the street, he's been shouted at, dégage, dégage, get out, get out. When Abdelrazak Sultani did the same, Abu Jidra Sultani, did the same, he's been shouted at, dégage, dégage. As a matter of fact, from the first week of the protest, people launched calls on social media asking for the Algerian to be very vigilant because they didn't want the scenario of the 90s to repeat itself. So the moderate Islamists in Algeria, the parties are in decline. They are seen by a majority of Algerians as being co-opted by the regime. Actually, according to the Arab Barometer 2018, only 14% of Algerians believe in political parties. 72% of them believe in the army. It's very enlightening. So what about the jihadists? Now we have talked about the moderate. The jihadist threat, you know, of course, the risk zero doesn't exist like in any other country. However, the jihadist threat has been reduced and went from lethal in Algeria to manageable. Today, we are we are in front of a country that is pretty secure, you know, and according to the Gallup, the latest Gallup report, Algeria ranked 7th safest country in the world. And today also the dream of building a caliphate by Algerians has not, you know, it's no longer a dream. It's very enlightening, for instance, to see that while Tunisia, which is the happy child of the Arab Spring, sent more than 6,000 of its followers to IS-held territories, only 100 Algerians left for IS-held territories. So this dream, also this belief that, you know, l'islam est la solution, or Islam is the solution, like the FIS used to chant it in the 90s, is no longer the dream of the new generation. But your point is true in the sense that today we have European neighbors that are very worried about the situation in Algeria. Actually, many European neighbors, you know, backed up Bouteflika for a 4th term and a 5th term even. So for them, you know, they see Algeria, which is true, as this big country, but also this pivotal actor in the fight against terror in North Africa and in the Sahel. So anything that might happen to this country, will have repercussion in Europe. So, of course, many European, you know, neighbors would say that having the military in power is the solution to avoid a further conflict. Yeah.
بالحديث عن ثنائية العسكر والمدنية كان عم يحكي يزيد عن
talking about the military versus the civil forces, my colleague was talking about the lack of political diversity in Egypt.
To what extent is what's happening in Egypt being created or being the make of the military? I believe that when we see or we hear such comments, mainly from the West, we always see a certain patterned Orientalism, saying that there is also certain oppression or a certain radicalization that is being produced in this problem. The Islamic or political Islamism and Islamic parties were used during the Cold War. If we remember, during the Cold War, where there were many leftist entities of different natures. In Sudan, there was a strong communist party. The same applies to Libya. It's no longer as strong as it used to be, because this led to different political leaders in Iraq from the Najaf and so forth. So if those countries or those communities are left to make a selection or to give rise or to produce any leaders, good leaders, they could do so. And here I would like to answer the question here, whether it is the fate of those communities to live as it is being decided for them. I would say not necessarily. The movements that started in the streets were done or the what happened in those countries is that political parties were weakened, the trade unions were weakened, and this political vacuum of the community of society, such as the case in Libya, produced those movements in the streets. Are we talking, Russia, about political plurality, about a civil political choice in Sudan? Can we talk about that? Yes, definitely. In Sudan, there is a choice to have a civic government or rule, because there were in October and April two revolutions in Sudan, and I believe that Sudanese are now immune to any Islamic intervention in Sudan, because the government or the current rule in Sudan lasted 30 years, and I believe that Sudanese will not accept, ethically and politically speaking, to reproduce the same rule. The problem in Sudan is that there are some regional powers that are against a peaceful transition. They want a government or a state that is tailored to their needs, and this will be at the expense of the Sudanese and the military. Regarding the question about the military and terrorism, my question is, until when this region should be torn into two extremism, or two extremes, excuse me. One is either to fall in the clause of terrorism and of radicalization, or to remain the prisoner of current weak entities. I believe military dictatorships led to the current impasse in these countries, as they tried to promote the fact that without the rule of the military there will be a weak state, and then those factions that are against any Muslim Brotherhood or terrorism are those which built empires on the expenses of the educated elite in our countries. So we do have two ideologies, such as the Islamic Brotherhood ideology that is against democratization. However, we can solve this problem when people are enlightened, and this requires open discussions among people. There should be a democratic dialogue, and there should be honest people working together towards ensuring peaceful transition towards democracy and civic rule. And in my opinion, democracy and civic rule to be successful should be combined with economic development and because this is the reason behind backwardness or lack of development and the spread of terrorism.
نرجع ناخذ اسئله. تفضل. انت بالعدد الاول قبل.
Let's take more questions, starting with you, sir.
I want to return to what you were saying about Libya being different from the Algerian or the Egyptian or the Sudanese case, because the military was not a strong institution in the country, and it was more centered around the rule of Gaddafi as a person or as a member of a tribe or whatever. is there, Jiber Ashkar, who spoke here, makes a distinction between patrimonial and neo-patrimonial regimes, and that neo-patrimonial regimes, the power is in the military, like Algeria and Egypt. But then there are the patrimonial regimes where power is really by a family or by an individual, such as Iraq and Syria and Libya. So I was wondering, how does the Libyan comparison in terms of the role of the military compare maybe not with other countries in Africa, but maybe with countries in the Middle East? And I'm thinking of Iraq and Syria and potentially Yemen. Is there some kind of, is the role different there? Or is the military stronger in Iraq than it is in Libya? But I mean, in both those countries, it was more, I think, Saddam and, as we see now, Bashar al-Assad, who have the power, not the military as such. So how does that compare with the Libyan case?
Yep. It's a good question. Whether we like certain regime or dislike them, this is not the issue. But if you compare Libya with Syria or Iraq, you will see, for instance, that let's take 2012 in Syria. The regime did not fall. The military stayed quite strong. Whether we like the regime or not, it has institutions. It has built a state along these decades of power. They managed to put something in place and showed how it resisted, and it was very resilient. In Iraq, don't forget that one of the first decisions that were made after the US invasion was to dismantle the army. That meant that there was an institution that was quite strong and held the country together. And we know what happened after that. In Libya, it's completely different. As I told you, because there was none. Because, as I explained, the way the state formation took place in Libya was completely different from the rest. And until today, Libya has always lacked institutions in general, and in particular, a military institution. And a political problem that existed prior to that led to 2011 and could have been managed politically has become a security problem. And you're now in a conundrum where you have to resolve the security situation to move to the political. In Yemen, it's the opposite. It's a political problem, not a security problem. You could resolve it by an agreement. And that agreement could have happened many years ago, but unfortunately, circumstances did not allow it then. So Libya is a particular case.
سؤال منك سامي. سامي.
Sami Kleib, I am a journalist and political writer. With the formation of Arab countries 70 years ago, 60 years ago, or 50 years ago, we saw that the military had a great role in power in these countries. So today a lot of people talk about an Arab NATO as if these countries are being reshuffled or reformed under new roles. We see that the military controls most Arab countries today. Most countries that have witnessed a change, a revolution, a coup, an upheaval, in most of these countries, the only alternative was the army. Maybe the reason was the fragility of political parties, of political institutions in these countries, but also maybe after the fall of the Islamist experience, what is required is to reproduce new Arab countries. This is my opinion, at least. So I would like to see if you agree with me on that opinion or not. Another thing is that I was very happy with the interventions of Mrs. Dalia, who talked about Algeria. We learned a lot from her. I also wanted to hear about the international dimension of the current situation in Algeria, such as the competition between the US and France over resources in Algeria. We also must talk about the role of France here. Also in Sudan, I would like to know know today, Ansar al-Sharia, who came back to the front again, do they have a role in the current composition in Sudan? Are they being supported by a specific party? Because we saw a lot of similarities between Algeria and Sudan in the past few years. We saw that the security situation changed quickly in Algeria, and today I heard senior officers in Algeria talking about very dangerous information being divulged about the role of France with some officers that were detained or imprisoned. So are we facing the new militarization of Arab countries as a sole alternative today? Because in Sudan, what we see, I believe that Russia's intervention was excellent about the international role in Sudan. There is no return of the army. The army was and will always be. I move to English.
Need to understand the role of the Algerian army today by understand from where this army came. And you said it yourself, this dichotomy between the French Hizb França. So let me give you a very small explanation. The army today in Algeria is basically the child of the army, the military wing of the FLN, the National Liberation Front, that fought French colonialism from 1954 to 1962. In 1958, there was a big bunch, if I may say, a big crowd of people who were actually working for the French army, who deserted. We call them les déserteurs, who played a very important role in during the War of Independence. Today, when we talk about the military, we tend to talk about it in a metonymic way, as if it was one and homogeneous. We don't really know who are the leaders, how many are they that are taken the decision. There is a new book that talks about approximately 200 individuals within the institution that are really les cerveaux, if I may say, the brains that are taking the decision. But more importantly, this army has this institutional culture and this self-perception. It sees itself, the army in Algeria, it's a fact, sees itself as having this almost messianic role. It is more knowledgeable than the civilians, it is more patriotic than the civilians, and hence it has always this duty to be, if I may say, the custodian of Algeria and of the Algerian people. And this didn't change, actually. As I said it was just from a period to another, being a ruler or an arbitrator. But the army has always ruled the country in Algeria. I think Mohammed Harbi, one of our greatest Algerian historians, had this wonderful quote that explained a lot in the Algerian case. He said it in French and then I'll translate it in English. He said, tous les États au monde ont une armée. En Algérie, l'armée a un État. All states in the world have an army. In Algeria, the army has a state. I think today is this quote is true than ever. The army has been, ruling, but behind the scene, it hasn't been governing. And as a matter of fact, in 2017, I was writing a paper on the regime and the secret behind the longevity of the regime. And one insiders of the army told me something that was very important. He said, have you ever seen in any of this demonstration a sign or a chant saying, Armée dégage? And I said, no. And he said, well, you know why? because the army doesn't govern day-to-day matters. It doesn't take, this kind of day-to-day policies, but it is taking the shot, calling the shot on all very important Algerian matters. But because it is not governing, the people do not ask it for accountability. But today, the situation is changing. For the first time ever, we've seen people taken up to the street and saying, لا للدولة العسكرية. لا للسيسي في الجزائر. People are scared of the Egyptian scenario of Gaid Saleh becoming Sisi made in Algeria. But paradoxically, they are also calling for the army to intervene. It is the people who called the army to intervene and to back up its call for the application of the Article 102 of the Constitution. But today, the people are asking for the military to install the Article 7 and 8 of the Constitution that says the people are the source of power. So, and this is me, thinking out loud. What is the way forward? How the Algerian problem can be solved right now? I think we are in a very dangerous situation in Algeria that if the chief of staff, Gaid Sayeh, doesn't leave and resign, we might see escalation from the Hirak. Because today the army is still standing with the people, and the people standing with the army. Algerians have been chanting for 14 weeks, Jish Shab Khawa Khawa. But they are also chanting for Gaid Saleh to leave. As I said it before, slogans were saying, روح يا بوتفليقة ودي معاك قايد صالح. Go Bouteflika and take with you Gaid Saleh. So the only solution right now is for Gaid Saleh to resign, and for also the Hirak to have a minimum and a modicum of institutionalization. And as a matter of fact, Gaid Saleh also have been playing on this very sensitive string. He said, I cannot negotiate with 40 million of Algerians. Give me leaders to talk to. And it is true, because the Hirak, unfortunately, hasn't been able to institutionalize itself. There is no leadership. Algerians don't want any leader. And actually, figures, very charismatic figures such as Mustafa Bouchachi, who is a very respected lawyer, is also very charismatic, very present, but people are scared of taking the lead because they are scared of the reaction of the people. So we have, in a way, military who are, going to have to rule the country and govern it. And the price for governing the country is going to be very hefty, because they might, as Yazid said, lose their reputation, the institutional reputation, and be there upfront to the critique of the people.
شكرا عليا. رشا، ردك رشا.
نعم. أيوة.
Rasha, would you like to respond? A very important question was asked about Ansar al-Sharia and their role today. Of course, this can be understood or must be understood in the context of the role of the military council to put pressure on the main revolutionary forces, and normally there should be negotiation between these two parties. However, when the military council found itself under pressure in this regard, they resorted to the games of the previous regime, and that is to use religion as a card. And they started, or they gave way, they gave support to the Salafist movements that replaced al-Bashir with the military council today. And now they have used Ansar al-Sharia for this purpose. So the military council is trying to say that this force should be a partner in the transition phase along with other partners. So of course the Sudanese people confronted this with very strong condemnation, because the target here is to destabilize the political scenery in Sudan. However, the use of religion in order to cause strife between the Sudanese is an old game, or an old tool used by the previous regime for the past 30 years.
الدين بالسياسة ولكي نتخلص من ذلك.
So the regime already used this tool, and we need a long-term project, a strong project to counter these attempts to install a civil rule, a secular rule. So nobody dares today to talk about this in public, even if they were from a leftist or progressist movement, because of the terrorist threat that was consecrated by political Islam. So it's a long-term battle. I will go to Yazid now for one last comment. I would like to talk about the comparison between the 50s and the 60s and today, when there were a series of coups or military revolutions in Arab countries for 20 years approximately. We had a case of military intervention until 1970, and then we saw 40 years of stability, with some exceptions such as Mauritania. And Sudan, of course. I believe, however, that on the one hand we are seeing the return of political movements of the military in many Arab countries, but on the other hand, I believe, and this is very important here, I'm not sure, that there is a lot of difference between the previous phase and the current phase. In the 20th century, the 50s and 60s, with all the military movements, came after the end of colonialism in this region. And after these countries learned how to become countries or states, of course there were social and political transformations. These institutions are all still young, and were all still young and new, and were looking for a place in the international scene. However, everything was in movement, and everybody was looking for a new equation internally and internationally. And to be more accurate, most military movements that we witnessed from Iraq to the Arab Maghreb came as a reflection of major social transformation in their communities, in their societies. So between 1900, 1910, if we compare this to 1940, for example, the number of children who went to school or to military school were double of what they were in the past. So if we look who came to power after the 50s and the 60s in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt, etc., most of them came from specific social categories, such as marginalized categories like the Alawites in Syria. They were able to make something of themselves because they went to school, they went to military academies, and they came to power. The same happened in Yemen, in Algeria, in Sudan, with some differences. What I mean to say is that there was social transformation in many Arab societies at that time. And one of the results of this transformation is new new categories of people making it to power, and some of them moved straight to from the military to political power. When we see, for example, the conflicts between officers of the Iraqi army in the 50s and the 60s that were ongoing, we talk about the same category in on many occasions, like the Sunnis and versus the Sunnis and Arabs, for example, because they have a different principle, because they come from different areas and cities in Iraq. Same for Egypt. So today we are witnessing a return of military intervention in politics in Algeria, in Mauritania, in Iraq, in Syria. I agree with Yunus here with what he said about Libya. I think it can be applied to many Arab countries. The military did not rule in many cases. There were a very important political party or institutional party. However, they rarely ruled. Even in Egypt, they ruled for a brief period of time after 1952, and then there was the conflict between Abdel Nasser and the General Abdel Hakim Amr. So that was that was the sum of all military interventions in politics in Egypt. So going back to today, the army, when we talk about officers, senior officers, middle rank officers, low ranked officers, all of them are not representative anymore of a social category of people that wants to reach power, but in many cases they are representing a force that wants to stay in power. They nationalized, for example, in lands in Egypt, in Syria, but today they are not doing that anymore. So we can see a very different social background in place today. Does this apply to military forces today? It's not clear. However, what catches my attention is that what is the relationship between the military role and the social transformations that we are witnessing today, and that led to this to the Arab Spring, to the Sudanese Spring, the Algerian Spring. And there is this huge gap between the rich and the poor.
This is something that we did not see in our part of the world in the past. There is also a regression of illiteracy, of the hypothetical age of people. So over the last 20 years, there was a decline that, and also most of the Arab people are now urban societies, so we did not see any political achievements that was reflected in the political life or the parliamentarian life in those countries, except with the upheavals that we saw in Egypt and in Syria, in rural Damascus. Microphone, please. Excuse me, we cannot hear what the speaker is saying. I apologize for interrupting you. Is what's happening in Arab countries is a return of the military in the public institutions, and given the regional and international interventions worldwide. What can we say here? We're talking about 5 countries, the military of which is being dismantled, while this is not the case in other Arab countries. And are we witnessing structural or pivotal rifts or changes in the Arab region? Are we witnessing the rise of an Arab NATO? For instance, we know the historical opinion of Algeria in the past and now. Are we talking about a restructuring of the Algerian army in this case? So this is the reason behind my question. Is there a certain deal that we are ahead of, which is shaped by the regional and international shifts? I did not hear anything about the international role except what Ms. Rasha mentioned about the regional support or intervention. I might not have touched upon the international role. Maybe other colleagues mentioned that. I believe that your question requires another discussion. The regional and international factor is very important. I agree. What's very clear is, and this is something I concur with you, is that the current circumstances, in a way or in another, dictate the options that the military has, be it in Egypt and Syria and Lebanon, and which urges them to act in a way or in another. And there is definitely an international element, and if there is a Russian, Iranian, or a different international element that is supporting one alternative or another, then this will also affect what happens in the different countries. I will not answer about the regional and international intervention or roles in the case of Sudan and Algeria, since we have speakers who can address that. However, if we compare the past century to the current one, we are ahead of a new era that is governed by the military action, and we need to understand that. So the inherent international factor, this is something that will be clarified or what that will become clear in the future. Are we ahead of an Arab NATO or not? I do not know. However, we need to see how the military will choose to act, be it in the case of Algeria, or how things are taking place in Libya. And we will not have the time to ask Russia. Maybe the difference in Sudan is that Gulf powers are supporting the military council, and in this case Turkey and other countries will find themselves in the same camp supporting Islamists. So this is the difference in the situation. What I would like to say is that the military in these countries are not shielded from what is happening in their communities, so they are an actor in what's happening in those communities.